Welcome to our lesson on scope management. In this lesson, we're going to show you our processes and strategies to effectively create and manage scope for your digital transformation initiative. Scope management is one of the key fundamentals for a successfully integrated core. In fact, one might argue that it's the most critical of the integrated core because if it's not clearly defined and controlled, it can cause serious damage to your digital transformation initiative. Do you remember a few lessons ago when we talked about the 43 to 65% of large-scale IT transformation initiatives that go over budget, are delayed, or don't complete the mission for which they were chartered? Well, a lot of that falls right here in scope management. This lesson is broken down into two core sections, defining scope and controlling scope. Now, depending on when you're watching this lesson, portions of the defining scope section were also covered earlier to prepare you for planning. If you feel you don't need a refresher on scope planning, then feel free to skip this definition portion and move on to controlling scope portion in the lesson. Though in my opinion, it's always good to have a refresher and look at the subject and its processes in its entirety from cradle to grave. All programs come in different shapes and sizes and clarity. To give you a construction analogy, if you are building prefab houses, you pretty much know what you need to do to build it and how long it's going to take. On the other hand, if you are asked to build an interplanetary space station, well, that's a little bit more ambiguous. Depending on the size and clarity of your digital transformation initiative, they may be large, onerous, and never been done before. So how do I best define these types of transformations and keep them under control? So let's carve out a couple of definitions that are closely related, but serve two purposes within this context of scope. In fact, one could argue that the one definition is actually a subcomponent of the other, but I don't want to get into semantics here. Scope management is defined as the set of processes required to ensure that your program includes all of the work required and only the work required to complete your digital transformation program successfully. Managing the program scope is primarily concerned with defining what is and is not included in your digital transformation program. Change control is a common process for resolving requested changes to the program scope. It is the process whereby documents, deliverables, or baseline associated to the program are identified, documented, approved, or rejected. Change control can support both project changes supported by your digital transformation program, as well as production changes that occur after go-live. The standard scope management processes that deliver the greatest success to your digital transformation programs are the ones defined here. First, we need to collect requirements, then define our scope. Then take that definition and put it into a work breakdown structure. Once we completed that, we need to verify scope. And as the program moves forward, we need to control that scope. Now, we will go into plenty of details on each and every one of these process steps in the slides to come. One of the best ways to start your collection of requirements for your scope is to look at your scope from a variety of levers, which, when combined, will give you a pretty good picture of the scope of your end solution. The following is a common list of the most typical levers of scope one will have to define the requirements for their digital transformation initiative. Let's take a quick look at each one of these levers. The first lever is software. What software applications, like SAP, Oracle, or Microsoft Dynamics, are going to be the foundational applications for your digital transformation? Or if you're developing from scratch, what development platforms are you going to be using? Organization lever. What parts of your organization are in scope for this digital transformation? Is it isolated to one or many business units? Is it isolated to a geographic region? Or is it the entire global enterprise? What jobs are going to be impacted as a result of this program? These are the types of questions that help drive significant portions of your organizational transformation scope. Next, there's business process. What business processes are going to be digitally transformed? This goes back to our conversations around value streams in our planning session. Think of all the different value streams that are in scope for your digital transformation program. Is it order to cash, plan to pay, record to receipt, or record to report depending on your naming conventions, hire to retire, enterprise asset management, environment, health and safety, data governance and management. The next lever you need to consider are reports, forms, and analytics. What reports and forms will you have to develop for this implementation? Which data analytics platform will you use? And this also could be part of your software scope. And exactly what is it that you tend to develop on your data analytics platform? Your next lever is interfaces and integrations. What interfaces are you going to have to develop to integrate into this new digital transformation technology so that it integrates with the rest of your future state operating model? How are you going to develop those interfaces? Are they going to be point-to-point or through an integration engine or middleware engine? If it's a middleware engine, again, this would be part of your overall software scope. What and how do you intend to develop that integration engine? Your next lever is around conversions and migrations. Are you going to be getting rid of a current solution as part of this digital transformation? How are you going to convert that data? What tools are you going to use to convert that data? Is that data old and out of shape? You might want to consider a rigorous data cleansing initiative because there is no sense of putting bad data in a new digital transformation product. Once your data is clean, how are you going to keep it clean? What about GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regulation? What tools will you need to govern your data moving forward? The outcomes of these conversations will drive your data migration scope and help further define your software scope. Your next lever is enhancements and workflows. Based on the foundational software packages selected and the high-level list of requirements developed from your digital use cases, will your selected software package cover all of your requirements? Or are you going to have to build some additional enhancements to that software or build custom workflows to help you with the automations in your new digital solution? Your next lever is security and job roles. What security is your new digital solution going to need? How are you going to protect your company's digital assets, your users' privacy? What job roles are going to be impacted in the security model? A key note here, this definition drives a major component of your organization transformation. Your next lever is infrastructure. What hardware and network infrastructure will be needed to run your new digital solution? What about cloud solutions? And finally, at least for this lesson, the last lever we'll discuss is mobility. What mobile devices are going to be supported on your new digital solution? How will they be connected? What custom development will be required to allow your users to function mobilely? By thinking through these levers of scope, you should have a pretty good idea of what is in and what is not in scope for your digital transformation initiative. This is a really important moment because the scope definition will be the basis for your future planning that will help define your program roles you'll need to deliver the scope, what estimating factors you need or need to develop to determine the standard efforts for the work packages required to deliver the scope, how many resources you are going to need by role within your program organization to meet the timelines you set out to deliver this initiative. All of this information drives into your program statement of work. Now, for those of you who have gone through the planning lessons, this is going to be a repeat. But it is a good refresher, so either indulge me for a moment or feel free to skip over this. Once you have defined your scope, you need to determine how you're going to break that scope down into projects, as well as the best methodology to use to deliver that scope for each of your projects. You do this by building out your work breakdown structure. A work breakdown structure is exactly what it sounds like it should be, a structured way to break down one's work. As I have mentioned before, there are a lot of ways to create a work breakdown structure. I have tried dozens of different approaches over the years. At the end of the day, it really comes down to your comfort level, which approach works best for your digital transformation program. So let me go quickly over the example of an integrated program plan. If we are using an integrated program plan approach, we most likely decided to use an integrated program methodology. Therefore, the first level of our work breakdown structure would represent the different phases within the chosen methodology for your transformation. For our example, we are using a generic waterfall methodology. Level 2 defines the major projects, project teams, and or project elements within your program. If we go back to our example organization and resource model in prior lessons, we have defined our level 2 to represent our projects and our process teams and enabling work streams: process, technology, data, and organization transformation. Our level 3 of our work breakdown structure represents what it is we're actually going to deliver in our digital transformation. It represents the types of physical deliverables you are going to deliver within that phase of the program within that project team. Level 4 traditionally represents the actual deliverables you are going to deliver within the scope of that project team. For example, at level 3, we determined that we needed a deliverable type called conversions, which will be needed by a level 2 project called order to cash that has been associated to a level 1 methodology called development phase. Now at level 4, we simply lay out the scope of the actual conversions that are in scope for the order to cash project. Level 5 represents the actual work products one has to produce in order to complete a deliverable. As you can see in the example here, in order to complete the deliverable at level 4 called pricing conversion, there are 10 separate work products or work packages that need to be completed first, of which I'm only showing 6 here due to the size of the screen. Work packages 1 through 3 represent the extract functional spec, the extract technical spec, and the extract code and unit test. Work packages 4, 5, and 6 represent the transformational functional spec, technical spec, and code and unit test. Work packages 7, 8, and 9 represent the load functional spec, technical spec, and code and unit test. And work package 10 is the assembly test that ensures that the extract, transform, and load code all work together as one integrated unit. As I mentioned before in previous lessons, you may or may not like this approach for your own structure, and you may want to come up with your own way. At the end of the day, there really isn't one right way of doing this. What we have found throughout the years is that by capturing key metadata elements, you can absolutely have all the freedom that you want and structure this program any way you want to. So within your project plan, be sure that you set up metadata that represents some of these key fields. Your program ID, your project ID, the methodology phase ID, your organizational ID, which is representing either your value streams or enabling streams, the deliverable type ID, the deliverable ID, your work package type ID, and your work package ID. Next, for each line that you have in your project plan, you must assign a value to each of these metadata elements. Once you have done this, you have a variety of ways of slicing and dicing this information within your plan, and as long as all your projects within your program are capturing these fundamental data points, you can maintain integrated congruence within these projects. Once you have gone through and built out your high-level program plan with all of your projects, methodologies, deliverables, work packages, estimated efforts, dependencies, and racing roles, and you have gone through and developed an estimated timeline for this effort, you are now in a position to sit down and do a final walkthrough to verify the scope, effort, timelines, and any key assumptions. Once you go over this and you have an agreement, this becomes your approved statement of work. And if you are the solution integrator or consulting company, this becomes your legal or commercial statement of work. Once you have the agreed and signed off statement of work, you are ready to start your delivery for your new digital transformation initiative. And this is usually where the changes start to happen. Change, for all intent and purposes, is inevitable on your program. Going back to my analogy earlier regarding prefabricated houses, unless you are installing an out-of-the-box, plug-and-play, no changes allowed cloud solution, you are most likely going to have some changes. How you control and manage those changes is what we'll be discussing next. Your program needs to have a rigorous and disciplined change control process. If you don't have this, you are going to be one of those statistics of failed IT-enabled transformation initiatives. The process we are going to cover here in its simplest form has 5 steps: identification, impact assessment, approval, implement, and monitor and control. When you get the first whiff of a change coming about, you're going to want to identify that change. As a rule, anyone on the team can identify and document the initial change request. However, in order for this change to have legs and get it through the change control process, it's going to need a sponsor. That sponsor should be someone with influence within your program who can properly represent and defend the need for the change request. It is really good at this time to start getting your ducks in a row and start building your benefits case for the requested change. You see, there is a program cost in the next step of the process, the impact assessment, because you're going to have to take people off of already predefined deliverables and work packages and ask them to work on something else that is not part of their resource capacity. Right there, you are putting your work packages and timelines at risk. So if you want to have any chance of getting this identified change through the next step, you're going to have some pretty compelling reasons. Otherwise, your change review board, at least a good one, will not make the investment in the impact assessment. Once you have your ducks in a row on your change request and are confident it will make it to the next step, you submit your change request to your change review board for their assessment. When we think of scope and scope creep, we are usually looking at it from a point of view of adding scope. But there are those occasions where the needle goes the other way. When we built our original plan and estimates, it was with the best intentions and with the best knowledge that we had at that time. However, things change, life changes, and sometimes our estimates are off. Where we had planned to build 50 integrations, maybe it only turns out that we need 45 integrations. In these situations, we still want to put a change request through our scope management process as a descoping change request. We will follow the same process, but our benefits case will be more geared towards project savings instead of the organizational benefits impact. Another concept is scope swap or trading scope. Using the same scenario we just described, we may determine that we no longer need those 5 integrations. But in order to descope those 5 integrations, we need to add 3 more data conversion objects. This becomes a little more complicated change request, but is still achievable with our process. The rule of thumb that I would use for a trading scope change request is to only perform these types of change requests when it's a true integration quid pro quo, meaning that you can't descope unless you add scope or vice versa. If there is not a true integration, my suggestion would be to treat them as 2 separate changes, one for descoping and one for scope addition, and let the change review board decide their fates independently. Assuming your change review board approves the initial request, your change request moves to the next stage, which is the impact assessment. This can be a pretty time-consuming effort depending on the complexity of the change and the impact it may have to one or many projects within your digital transformation program. As part of the impact assessment, an impact assessment owner must do their due diligence to identify all the aspects of the program that can be impacted by this change request. As part of this analysis, the impact assessment owner will essentially go through all the levers of scope that were used to define the program and analyze where the impacts might be. It is important that the impact assessment owner provide a high-level estimate of impact for each project deliverable that will need to be changed as a result of this change request so that the change review board has a full understanding of the impact. While this work is going on, the change request sponsor can continue their due diligence on the supporting business case, further quantifying the revenue generating capabilities, cost reduction capabilities, or risk avoidance components that this change will have to the business to further defend the merits of the change request and position it for development approval. Once the completed cost impact and benefits case are ready, the change request is submitted to the next stage for development approval. At this stage, your change review board will be taking a hard look at the benefits case for the change and the associated impact and risk this change may have to your overall program. As part of their analysis, they will do an assessment of the accuracy of the estimates, the number of integration impacts associated to the change, the current state of the program, are they behind or ahead of schedule, the available capacity across the changes to take on the additional work, as well as the reserve funds available to pay for the additional work. When they factor these and whatever other factors or standards have been established by the governance board, they will need to ask themselves this question: is the juice worth the squeeze? In other words, do the benefits of the change outweigh the cost and potential implementation risks to the program? If the answer is yes, you move on to the development stage. As part of the development approval stage, the change request has been funded and a development manager has been assigned. As part of the preparation, the development manager will go through the impact assessments and the requirements of the change and lay out their detailed plan. Depending on the thoroughness of the impact assessment, this can be an easy or difficult task. The development manager will rework their project plans to account for the additional work and get the work going into their planned work streams. Now here's where it can get a little bit tricky on what to do with your change request next. It all really depends on where you are in the life cycle of your program. If you are in the initial development stage or earlier of your program, you will just take on this work as part of what you need to do for preparation for system and integration test. If you're already in system or integration test, the challenge is to get this change in as soon as possible. You would then have to submit the change request to the change review board for final review and approval to release it to the next test environment. If you're already in production and this is an urgent change request to your production environment, you now need to be asking for approval to your quality environment and then hopefully to your production environment. As part of this stage, your change review board has final disposition on if, where, and when this change request should be deployed. The monitor and control process is where all the process controls, governance, and reporting occurs. It is highly recommended that you have an automated control system to handle this process. On most programs, there are millions of dollars at stake for these change control processes. Running your processes and controls and reports on spreadsheets, emails, and PowerPoints is not a good way to govern this sum of money. This slide is a good representation of the entire process flow in swim lane form, so you can get an idea of the key steps across the stages, the key decision points, and an understanding of who is responsible for what throughout the entire process. Feel free to pause and take a snapshot of this diagram for future reference. So now that we have gone through the overall process controls for managing changes throughout our program, I wanted to spend a little time discussing some of the additional tips on controlling scope throughout your program. As I mentioned earlier, change on your program is inevitable, but these tips can help lessen the amount of change and allow you to focus on the critical changes that provide the most value to your organization without significantly impacting your overall program. There was a recent study I read that said that 75% of IT professionals think that their projects are doomed from the start. Do you know why? Regularly changing program requests lead to scope creep, which ultimately creates a gap between your business goals and program objectives. Ask any program manager, all of them will tell you that scope creep is their worst nightmare. Fortunately, there are some solutions out there to avoid scope creep. Here are a few tips that we have gathered from experts in the field and learned over the years ourselves to help you combat the dreaded scope creep. It sounds simple, but the first step is to define the scope of your program in detail. We have discussed this in great detail throughout this course and in this lesson. By going through the levers of scope and developing your deliverables and subsequent work packages, you should have a firm handle on the boundaries surrounding your program. A clearly defined scope of work is an important part of setting expectations at the beginning of your program. It will be much easier to identify and manage scope creep by documenting the details of your program before you start your work. Discuss deliverables, timelines, milestones, duties, and responsibilities for both you and your client. Collaborate and outline a clear plan of action to help you both meet your program goals. As you gather a list of requirements, be sure to speak with all stakeholders involved to ensure you don't overlook any client expectations. If your client isn't bought into the scope, they are likely going to change their mind and the deliverables later on. Ensure that the client understands what is and isn't in scope. Don't just send a document outlining the deliverables. Speak to them and walk them through it properly. Be transparent. Ask questions such as, are you clear on what the deliverable is and what you will get? Create a scope management plan in your program planning phase. This does not have to be a 15-page document. You just need to know how you will manage scope changes and make sure your sponsor agrees with the process. We highly recommend you follow the scope management steps and change control process outlined in this course. Often we receive scope change requests that explain the benefits of the change. When we take this to the sponsor will likely say yes since all they see is benefits. They don't see the impact to the program. It is usually the case that the scope change requires more work, and this can lead to an impact on schedule and budget. But don't stop there. Often scope changes can increase program risk. They may have staffing implications. They may impact vendors or procurements. The key is to identify the total impact to your program in all elements of program management. By establishing a rigorous change control process, heavy focus on the impact assessment, and establishing a strong governing change review board, you already have half the battle won. Now all you have to do is the benefits model described in the lesson, and you will combat the scope creep. Often your project managers and project teams do not recognize when a change has occurred. This is a sign of scope creep. There are small incremental changes that we either do or do not recognize as scope changes, or we choose to ignore them because they are small. We call this the proverbial scope death by 1,000 paper cuts. All scope changes should be recognized and taken through the scope management process. Small changes may have their own simple process for evaluation and approval, but all the changes need to be managed. Every time your customer changes deliverables, boundaries, or requirements, make sure that you document the change and then review the impact of that change. Each change does not need to be a separate change form, but all changes should be documented in your change log. Then you'll be sure that your initial scope plus your scope change log will be reflected in the final deliverables. If you take verbal scope changes without documenting them, there will be a gap between the agreed scope and the final solution that may be difficult to explain. Sometimes team members choose a way to solve a problem that has an impact on scope, often without even realizing it. Even adding a half a day of extra work to do something slightly different could have an exponential impact on the rest of your program. For example, if a designer decides to include some functionality on a site without discussing it with the developer, who knows what this could do to the overall scope without any investigation. Make sure you set up your team from the beginning of the program to work together and understand each other's decisions. When someone raises a query or issue with you directly, share it with everyone if there is a bigger decision to be made. Get people working together to define and find solutions to problems. Make sure everyone is in contact, whether face-to-face or remote, regularly. Most successful programs are enabled by teams who work well together. Clear communication is a key to eradicate scope creep issues. Due to the dynamic nature of project management, clients will come up with new requirements every now and then. This can make things difficult to manage for project managers and their teams. To prevent this situation, you should establish a two-way communication and communicate regularly with your client so that both parties are fully aware of what to expect from each other. A communication gap between clients and project managers usually leads to scope creep, which could push your project towards failure. If you are serious about keeping the scope creep issue to a minimum, then be proactive to prevent scope creep problems. Gone are the days where you do a month or two of work and then send the final results of this period to your client for feedback. This results in surprises, with finalized work having to be redone and impacts to the project timeline and budget. Collaborate closely with your client. Show them work in progress, iterate, and proactively involve them through the journey. Engage your clients regularly on their requirements and get things approved from them. Prepare a document which you can use as a reference in the future if scope creep issues arise. Clients should be clear about what they're getting. Online team collaboration tools may help you collaborate more efficiently. Moreover, you should arrange meetings with the client regularly to keep them involved in the whole process. At the end of the day, you are responsible for all the project work. If a change in scope comes up, take the lead and meet with your client to discuss how the change fits into the overall project and how it will impact timelines. Provide your professional input, work together to make the decision, and then carry out the course of action. Sometimes a change request may come up that clearly does not add value to the program or may even negatively impact the work of your program long term. In these situations, it's okay to say no. Clearly present your case to your client and discuss the best way forward. If a client is set on making specific changes, consider compiling the request into a separate project you can begin once you complete your current project. This will enable you to stick to your current agreement rather than continually making changes along the way. When a client approaches you with additional requests, start by reminding them what your original scope of work entailed and then present them with two options. You can either add to the requested work for an additional expense or you can agree with the agreed upon scope of work. This gives the client a simple choice and you won't lose out on your own time and compensation. When you are up against scope creep or managing a dynamic project, effective change management is crucial for success. Managing changes to the original scope of work is critical for keeping projects under control. It is important to use change control forms to analyze the impact of changes with respect to the time, cost, and essentiality. Program managers are fully responsible for not only tracking these changes, but also testing those changes before implementing them. Although these activities can take a lot of time, they can reap rewards when it comes to resolving scope creep issues. Again, I want to emphasize, if you follow the processes provided in the lesson, you'll be able to properly assess the cost-benefit of the change and have a full understanding of the impact that this change will have to your overall program with fully vetted alternatives to choose from. The old age issue of estimation, or not giving enough time to do something. Estimation is a very difficult thing to get right. It's a challenge to be accurate at the beginning of a project when there are so many unknowns. Certain things may not get accounted for, and you end up tied to this extra scope to be able to deliver your overall program. How can you accurately estimate how many bugs will be raised? How long will it take to fix? And what impact will they have? Well, a couple things come to mind. First, involve your whole team in the estimation up front. Don't work in a silo and make guesses. Ensure you've explored and determined client and business requirements against your user requirements before estimating. This approach will also help you get your team's buy-in into the whole program or project as they were engaged in setting up these estimates. They will own its delivery. We can also help mitigate this old adage by using the critical chain technique. Through the statistical modeling, we can estimate a percentage of the overall work to be part of the contingency buckets for those work packages that go over our initially estimated forecast. Remember, statistically speaking, 50% of the time things will get delivered under budget, and 50% of the time things will be delivered over budget. Use your buffer management technique to manage these ebbs and flows. Scope creep generally applies to projects with a fixed scope. But what if you're using an agile methodology? Well, agile embraces change, and frankly, so should you. If you are working within different processes or methodologies, change should not be seen as the enemy. As one of the core principles of agile states, welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. If you are working using the Scrum methodology, for example, when a new requirement comes in, pull it into the sprint planning meeting and get it into the backlog. Prioritize it with the product owner and team. And if it does go into the sprint, something else will be deprioritized instead. Because details aren't determined at the beginning of the project, change can be incorporated. Stories can be swapped quite easily for other stories if they require the same effort. The very point of Agile is to iterate, which means designing, building, testing, learning, and then repeating the cycle. Change is what leads to the best possible product in the time you have. So what actually counts as scope creep in an Agile project? Since you have the ability to change scope quite easily without throwing the whole project to the lines, scope creep in Agile doesn't really affect you until later down the line. Scope creep comes into play if your product owner doesn't deprioritize features or tasks when pulling something in, i.e. if they want to add something to the current cycle without removing something else. Also, they might not weigh the effort needed between the two tasks and deprioritize one, which could result in trying to cram extra effort into an already planned too tight cycle. Make sure that for any new features entering the backlog, you're breaking these down into stories effectively and understanding effort against them to prioritize accordingly. If you have a product owner who understands this process, scope creep will be much less of a threat. In general, it's a lot easier to mitigate scope creep in an Agile project precisely because change is encouraged and factored into the structure of the methodology itself. As the product owner, you have to be mindful of your program's time and budget constraints. Though you are handling stories, functions, and features at the product level, you have to understand the impacts this might have to your overall program. Your product owner needs to have the discipline to keep a balanced scorecard of changes out and changes in, especially when additional time and money is involved. In the event a particular project or product cannot deliver its essentials needed for the overall program to meet its timelines and budget, you'll have to go through your change control process. Your product owner will be your change request sponsor and will need to work with your change review board to get these additions added to your overall program budget and/or timeline. One of the biggest reasons why scope creep negatively affects programs is because project managers take it lightly and ignore it. Spending the time up front to lay the groundwork and clearly defining scope will help you keep the project on track. When the client inevitably makes out-of-scope requests, don't be shy about telling them that you'll add their request to a phase 2 of the project, which will have its own scope and cost. In order to prevent scope creep or manage it efficiently, you have to push aggressively to eliminate it and follow a proactive approach instead of a laid-back one. I think this is a good recap tip and a good way to conclude this lesson. Hopefully you have come to appreciate the seriousness of scope management and how important it is to the overall success of your program. As you can probably tell, the processes that we have learned here today are pretty well vetted and handle nearly every tip and technique described by the experts we studied, plus our own experiences on the topic. You are now in a great position to be an effective scope manager for your next program. And this concludes our lesson on scope management. I'm looking forward to seeing you at our next lesson.